We are live. So hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Vincent. I'm a campaigns committee member with TTCriders. And thank you for spending your beautiful Sunday afternoon here with us to talk about public-private partnerships. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by my guests. First, we have V Bui. V is the water campaigner for the Council of Canadians. And I'm also joined by Stuart MacKay, who is the co-founder and a board member of Ottawa Transit Riders. So before we get started and really launch into the panel, it is important to acknowledge that Toronto, where I am recording from, is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and indeed all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So a bit of an idea of how this panel is going to go. We're going to start off by talking about what exactly are P3s for those who might be unfamiliar with the concept and why they're so concerning. We're going to talk about the federal government's much vaunted Canada Infrastructure Bank and what role it's going to play, unfortunately, in the post-pandemic bailout. And finally, we're going to discuss how we as activists and concerned people can organize to stop P3s. So it's going to be a really great conversation this afternoon. But before we do launch into the thick of it, it's going to be pretty helpful to define what a P3 is and what makes this model of building infrastructure particularly problematic. So V, I'm going to pick on you first, because you're particularly well placed to tell us exactly what a P3 is and why it's so concerning.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. And
no problem.
Before I launch in, I'd like to acknowledge that I dialed in from this webinar from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and or so-called Ottawa. And we've been spending a fair bit amount of time at the Council of Canadians fighting P3s and ultra reform. In my role, I spend a lot of time looking at water and wastewater projects. P3s are short for public-private partnerships. So these are the forms of a project where the private sector play a very significant role in a combination of financing, building, operating and maintaining infrastructure and services. And in Canada, it's somewhat less common to have a full form of privatization when a private company completely own and operate something like your water or transit. But P3s is a form of privatization where the government, oftentimes municipalities, still own the infrastructure or services, but the operation or the financing is up to the private sector. And P3s have been peddled by past and present government, federal level governments for decades, whether it's liberal or conservative. Under the Harper government, any federal investments that's over $100 million has to go through a P3 screen. So you can't get federal funding without going through P3s. And the problem with P3s have also been very well documented, not just in Canada, but around the world. These projects cost taxpayers more, they're shrouded in secrecy, they're not held accountable in the same way the public projects are, and they often result in lower quality and higher user fees. And I'll spend a little bit of time unpacking those.
Sure.
So they cost more, often because when you involve a private investor in financing a project, the private sector have to borrow money at much higher interest rate compared to the public, compared to your government. So whether it's federal, municipal, or provincial, you can borrow about between like 2-3%. Private investors have to go at least 7%. So basically what that means is your project cost just ballooned by at least like 50%. So there has been a series of reports by the Ontario Auditor General that has demonstrated that P3 just end up costing taxpayers more money. In a report that reviews 74 P3 projects, they show that it costs, in Ontario, it costs taxpayers $8 billion more money to use P3 rather than if you just finance it publicly. And because it has a higher project cost, it basically also means that it often results in higher user fees. Private investors are often interested in projects that has some fees associated with them, whether it's transit fares or road tolls or water and wastewater rates. And oftentimes, these rates are increased to make up the higher project costs, as well as to line the pockets of shareholders, who have to make profit off of operating these projects. So in my line of work focusing with water and wastewater, increase in water and wastewater rates actually affect the lower income communities the most, and often could violate their human right to water if they can't have access to water because they can't pay. And and that is a reality. The same can be applied for like transit tolls, transit fares. P3s are also oftentimes involve private competitors in the procurement process. And what that basically means is you have no idea what happened until it's all resolved. Most of the competition and procurement process is done behind closed door, in closed session, and the public aren't often able to attend or even find out what happened in those meetings. And you can't hold anyone accountable or ask important questions before it's too late. I'm sure Stuart can fill us in on the LRT stage 2 procurement, but I was like in the council chamber remembering the discussion of when they were trying to get questions about why SNC Level become the proponent of stage 2 LRT, and then council was forced to sign on a contract, and then months later found out that they actually didn't meet the technical score. Like, those are the kind of accountability that we do not have when the procurement is happening through P3s. And then it's also not accountable to the public in many other ways. It's often several companies coming together as a consortium, a faceless consortium, where you don't know who to demand, who to hold accountable, who to ask questions to, compared to a public entity. And there has been many studies done after the Walkerton crisis, the water crisis in Ontario, where they've shown that private companies, when they operating water system in particular, are less likely to go above and beyond and make the unnecessary investments in the public interest. They won't take precautionary or proactive upgrades, and they also less likely to apply a pricing scheme that preserve or conserve water, which is what we're looking to do. And lastly, they tend to cut costs. They are private investors who try to make money, so they cut costs. They reduce workforce, not offering long-term jobs, take shortcut, and as a result, we see a reduction in quality. A very infamous example in water is a privatization of water in Hamilton, when you see, like, as soon as the company was privatized, they cut half of the workforce. So there's a lot of concerns with P3s, and I'll stop there, and then let Stuart fill us in on some of the specifics of what a P3 could play out.
Sure, yeah. So that's actually a very interesting breakdown of the whole situation. You know, P3s are used in the construction and operations of all kinds of public infrastructure. We talked about water and wastewater as a good example of that. New transit lines and projects are some of the most expensive projects in Canadian cities, full stop. And it's going to be expected, you know, as you said, pretty much all levels of government love to employ P3 to design, build, finance, and operate new transit and fare media. Well, sometimes not operate, but the rest they do. So thank you, for walking us through the big picture. Now, Stuart, it's your turn to get picked on. Your city is the poster child right now for the failures of P3s. Now, I visit Ottawa frequently because I have family who live there, my aunt and cousins, and they could tell you all about how the LRT is broken down. But could you tell us a little bit about how this new line is faring, and perhaps how the Rideau Transit Group, the consortium, failed to live up to expectations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. This is a really important panel, and especially sort of now as we're facing one of the biggest crises in public transit. It's essential to understand how we're going to be moving forward over the course of the next few years. One of the things with Ottawa's LRT, and you're absolutely right, it has been highlighted not only sort of in local news, but in national news and international news. It even made the New York Times. And when you have a transit system that makes the New York Times for failing, that's not a good sign. One of the things I think it's important to understand for those people who don't live in Ottawa is that the design of the LRT was it was actually the first time a North American city has switched over to a light rail system from a bus only system. Most LRT systems are built up gradually on greenfield sites, and they allow sort of ridership to accumulate naturally. But this was a complete transformation of an established rapid transit bus system into a light rail system. So for those who don't understand the picture of it, the LRT that was built goes from east to west directly through downtown Ottawa itself. It's a 12-kilometer electrified line that runs above ground but also underground, and it cost about $2.1 billion to build. And when it was the history of light rail in Ottawa is very, the city of Ottawa had not had electrified light rail systems since the 1950s. So there was no sort of experience in the city itself about how to build the system. And so the city had to offload all the responsibilities to a consortium, RTG, or Rideau Transit Group, but everybody calls them RTG around here, which was made up of a consortium of NSC Lavalin, Ellis Don, and Grupo ACS, which is a company based out of Madrid. So RTG basically was responsibility for building the entire LRT from scratch, building the workforce, the construction, and maintaining the line, which is also crucial. They have a 30-year contract for a maintenance contract to maintain the LRT. And as soon as construction began in 2013, there were problems from the get-go. There was delays in terms of tunneling issues. There was a massive sinkhole that opened up downtown, right in the middle of one of the busiest intersections in downtown Ottawa, and which delayed construction even further. And there were these constant construction issues, and sort of going back to that question of transparency. One of the questions that we're never able to get answered during all these construction issues is, okay, how is construction proceeding? What are some of the issues? How are you going to rectify these issues itself? And because you're dealing with a private company, you weren't able to get these answers. And so reporters would actually phone up RTG and say, okay, well, have you figured out the cause of the sinkhole? Have you figured out the cause of these incidents? And they just would never get back to them because it's a private company itself. So that sort of started the LRT project off on the wrong foot. The construction kept getting delayed. There was questions with testing the line itself. It was supposed to open in November of 2018. That got pushed back a year because of testing itself. And so when the line finally opened, nobody had sort of really thought about how this line would operate. And so in the past, Ottawa is as with most cities, but Ottawa in particular, because of the high percentage of people who work for the federal government downtown, it's very much a commuter base. So you have previously you had buses which ran from the East End, the South End, and the West End directly into downtown. What they did now with the LRT is that you could take a bus from the ends of the city and you go to a passenger transit point in the West End or the East End or the South End. And then you get on the LRT and you take that downtown itself. And so what happened was that this system depends on all three of these passenger stations working perfectly until the second stage of the LRT, which would have expanded it, was completed. So anytime that there's a delay, anytime that there's an issue with a train at one of the stations, the whole line is incredibly fragile and things start falling apart. So, in the first week of its full operation, there was issues with doors closing. There's that famous shot of people who one of the things that happened is one of the West End stations, Tunney's Pasture, is the offloading point for all these buses that come in from the West End suburbs. And so people would just be unloading off these buses, and they get to the train station, the train wouldn't be working. And so you have these people who are crowding in, and there's a critical mass developing, and nobody knew what was going on. It turns out that there was a door issue at one of the stations. And so you have that famous shot of these people who are hiking 3 kilometers to get to downtown Ottawa because the train's not operating, they don't have buses and so on. So, for the issues just kept mounting over the course of the 6 months after it opened. Not only with door issues, not only with train issues, there was issues with the transmission wires actually being ripped out of one of the stations, closing down the line itself. It turns out that the trains weren't being cleaned properly. So there was a buildup of carbon, there's a buildup of salt on the trains, which were preventing transmission, which were causing the trains to essentially short out in one sense. And there's questions as to whether or not these trains can really operate in what they called wet or inclement weather, which, if you have been to Ottawa in the wintertime, you know that wet inclement weather is pretty much status quo from October till April. So there's all these questions about how, why aren't these trains working? There's questions about the stations themselves. Were they built too small? The platforms weren't long enough. And so the ridership in Ottawa, we're complaining, but the issue we have with the P3s is that rather than complain to OC Transpo, you complain to OC Transpo, and then they complain to RTG, who's actually responsible for the sites in the system which they control. So you could basically say to OC Transpo, one of the sort of most practical issues about P3s is that there's a tendency to try to cheap out on materials. And one of the things that we found here in Ottawa is that in the construction of the stations, instead of perhaps getting a tile or a flooring, which would be better in the wintertime when when riders are tracking slush through stations, when they're tracking water and so on, they went with a tile that gets very slippery in when it gets wet. And so you have these stations themselves, which are, as soon as you get a bit of snow on the ground and people are tracking all the snow and it melts, you have these puddles and people are slipping and people were falling, and a few people actually injured themselves fairly seriously because they went with a tile that was pretty cheap. And so, even just that in terms of a P3, rather than somebody sort of saying, okay, let's invest in better quality material, let's invest in material that will stand up, that will be sort of all season material. They basically said, what can we do for the cheapest price and throw it down as quick as we can? And the result is you have these stations which, when the weather gets poor, are very hard to traverse and are actually dangerous for those people who have mobility or accessibility issues itself. So, we have been dealing with these questions, and the city has been dealing with these questions themselves. And one of the biggest things that has surprised me and has surprised many people is that the city essentially has to continuously go and ask RTG, who's running the LRT, to fix problems. So the city is basically the nagging parent in this instance, who is constantly going, an issue, something goes wrong with the LRT, and then of course the general manager of OC Transpo and the transit commissioner and sometimes the mayor have to go to RTG and say, can you fix this? And who knows what RTG says, because it's a private conversation, and then it doesn't get fixed and they go back and fixing it. So there's this constant sort of nagging process that happens with P3s, where to actually try to get anything done, to try to get anything fixed, it's really up to the private company, and they don't have that accountability. that a publicly owned organization like OC Transpo would have. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with the LRT in Ottawa is that, for this first 6 months of its operation, it operated without, it had problems on about 54% of its running times. And, that is no way to run a public transportation system because, the premise is you're building a reliable public transportation system. If it's not reliable, people aren't going to use it and ridership is going to go down itself. So, the stage we're at now, ironically enough, with unfortunately with everything that's been happening in the world right now, it looks like April is actually going to be the best month that the LRT has had since it opened because nobody is riding it. And so, if you have a transit system that only operates well with, less than 10% of the ridership that it normally has, then there are some issues. And the city itself has actually gone to RTG and they've issued what's called a notice of default. And that is essentially the first step in potentially terminating the city's contract with RTG. And it's a 30-year maintenance contract. So the city pays RTG about $5 million a month to maintain the light rail system. And they've asked RTG to sort of give them a timeline on when a lot of these issues are going to be fixed. And even when RTG has put forward this timeline, there are these questions that have remained, and the city is now has to go back and say, okay, well, we need more specifics. When is this element of the train going to get fixed? When are you going to fix the pantographs which connect the which have had these issues itself? And so we're now back and forth with this whole, well, you need to fix things, but what are the mechanisms of accountability that we can use? And the only one that the city has is withholding these monthly payments itself. So, when you think about the time and the energy and the effort that is put in by city staff, by political staff, by councillors themselves who, on top of the constituency issues that they deal with, they're also dealing with this. You're investing a huge amount of time and energy and effort into just making sure that the trains run on time. And I think that that's really highlighted one of the biggest problems with the P3s is that nobody is putting up their hand and saying, okay, this is what's going wrong. This is how we're going to fix it. And this is when we're going to fix it. So that's how the LRT is faring pretty much at the moment in Ottawa.
Thanks, Stuart. It doesn't sound like a fun situation, to say the least. But Ottawa is hardly the only place where P3s are going to leave people stranded, often quite literally. Now, I do apologize to everyone who's listening today. We were supposed to have a third panel member, Robert Ramsey from the Canadian Union of Public Employees. He is unable to join us. I was going to have him give us some examples of P3 projects in other cities and the risks they pose for transit users, but instead you're going to get me talking about Toronto. So apologies to anyone from the rest of Canada, but you're going to hear a little bit more about Toronto. So where I'm based and where my organization TTCriders is based, we have a sort of a multi-tier transit system. So the local municipalities in the GTA, so Toronto and the nearby suburbs of Markham, Pickering, York Region, what have you, each operate their own transit systems. And aside from York Region, all of them are public systems. So they're essentially city departments. So the Toronto Transit Commission, those are city employees who run the trains, drive buses, maintain vehicles, clean stations, which is, people complain about the TTC, but we don't have anything near to what Ottawa is going through right now. However, there's also a regional transit agency, Metrolinx, which is tasked with planning and producing regional scale rapid transit and integrating the fare systems of the GTA. They also run GO Transit, so the regional commuter rail and buses. And they're heavily invested in the P3 model. So, I'll give you a few examples of this. For the past decade, like I said, there's a number of municipalities in Greater Toronto. Previously, they all operated their own forms of fare media. So one of Metrolinx's roles from 2009 onwards was to transfer in stages all of these systems to the Presto smart card, which is also used in Ottawa. It sounds great. Why not integrate the fares in that way. People don't have to carry tickets and cash for different transit systems. But from the very beginning, the province contracted Accenture, a consulting firm, to design, build, operate, and maintain the Presto system. So each time anyone pays a fare, Accenture takes a cut. So 5.25% of every transit fare doesn't go to helping your transit system run. It goes to helping Accenture do what they do with their money. And if you're a transit rider in Toronto, it would appear as if Accenture doesn't do much with that money. So over the past several years, we've had recurring issues with Presto card readers not working on the buses. They have fare gates in subway stations that are also Presto operated. They will bust and sitting open for who knows how long. And since it's an Accenture system, the TTC has no repair personnel to go ahead and fix these readers or to reboot them on the bus. They actually have to have Accenture contractors call in order to fix them. And based on what V said, they're going to be cutting costs. They're not going to maintain a large staff of contractors ready to go to fix the system. So a bus will go its entire service day without collecting any fare. Toronto's also in the midst of a fairly large rapid transit expansion. We have a number of LRT projects underway. The Crosstown LRT, which is a hybrid underground and surface light rail, is on its way to completion. And we've started some preliminary work on other lines as well, Finch West and the Ontario line. So all of this sounds great, just like Presto, but as usual, the devil's in the details. So we almost remember these projects are P3s as well. So for the Crosstown, the consortium, the faceless consortium, is made up of 26 companies, and they will design, build, and maintain the new line. In this case, once it's operational, the TTC will actually operate it. So will be TTC staff physically running the trains. The reason for that was there were some concerns about who would operate shuttle buses if the trains were down. But the other new lines that are going to be built subsequent to this Crosstown, which, by the way, the Crosstown is going to be ready supposedly in 2022, but there's been a set of delays. And of course, now we have the COVID situation. So really, who knows? But the further line, so the Finch West and the Ontario line, fall under a provincial law, Bill 107, was passed last year by the Ford government. And all of these new projects are no longer under the City of Toronto's jurisdiction. They're under Metrolink's jurisdiction, even ones that are entirely within Toronto, so not regional. They won't be TTC operated, which of course opens the door to a mishmash of private lines. As an aside, Metrolinx is often mused about getting rid of the flat fare systems that operate in the GTA and replacing them with zones and multi-fare tickets and this sort of a thing. In other cities that we have had these P3 lines, it does cost a separate fare to transfer between bus and rail, which tends to hit lower income folks more, as they'll not be able to afford to live in the central city and commute long distances. So there's a number of issues with this. And even with the TTC set to operate the Crosstown, we've already seen hundreds of millions in consulting fees paid to the consortium by Metrolinx. The Provincial Auditor General, Bonnie Lysyk, in her 2018 report, found there was absolutely no quality control with these payments. So was the consulting work actually useful? We don't know, but the consortium got $700 million out of it. So I guess they're walking away to the bank. And Metrolinx also has no way to hold the consortium, it's Crosslinks Transit Solutions is the name, to hold Crosslinks to account. It's actually written into the P3 agreement that they have no mechanism to hold them to account. So you can imagine here, risk is not being transferred to the private sector. And our worry as TTC riders that we're going to have the same situation as Ottawa, where the mayor and a council is going to be begging the consortium to actually fix problems on the Crosstown. So we're going to see how that plays out. But of course, we're in a pandemic situation right now, and the federal government's starting to plan for various kinds of stimulus in response to the post-COVID recession, just like back in 2008, which I remember when I was much younger. Spending on infrastructure is going to be a big part of that recovery plan. Again, just like with Metrolinx, this sounds great, but it's going to be quite problematic. So the government expects something called the Canada Infrastructure Bank to play a major role in this stimulus spending. So V, I'm going to pick on you now again. Can you speak about the Canada Infrastructure Bank and why we should be concerned about this?
Absolutely. And for months and months, I was doing my reading on all the problems of Canada Infrastructure Bank while also writing the Ottawa LRT. So it was just like, how do we learn from our prevalent lessons? But so a little bit of context about the bank. Like I said before, we spent a decade of Harper. Basically, in order for municipalities to get funding from the federal government for infrastructure projects, you have to go through P3s. It's so common. And then the federal Liberal ran on a platform to say, we'll establish a Canada Infrastructure Bank that basically will support municipalities and Indigenous communities and sometimes provinces to help with essential infrastructure projects, which is amazing because we know that municipalities have been underfunded for decades. Our infrastructure gap is massive, and it's result of just decades of just ignoring and downloading costs in municipalities. And so we were very excited when the announcement of the infrastructure bank the promise of the infrastructure bank was put forward. And then lo and behold, in 2017, the bank was established with a $35 billion mandate to attract private investors in funding infrastructure projects. So it's not going to be a bank that actually lend or provide funding for municipalities at a low interest rate for them to actually embark on the much needed infrastructure projects in their community. Instead, an opportunity for more P3s, essentially, is what we're looking at. So they have, since 2017, announced funding for 9 different projects. And that area of funding for projects, I would give them the credit that these are areas where we really need investments in. Those are public transit, those are regional rails, hydro, water, wastewater, broadband, a lot of areas where investment not only is needed, but also critical if we want to transition to a low carbon economy, where we want to see people taking more transit, having a low carbon electricity grid, having reliable and affordable water sources, that sort of thing. And then what we see, unfortunately, is that a lot of these projects are just essentially a way for the federal government of, instead of lending money at a very low interest rate directly to municipality for them to embark on these projects, to lend it to a private investor for them to come in and turn a project into a P3 project. So I spent a lot of time looking at their focus on water and wastewater projects, because the truth is that water P3s is a very hard to break in sector. There's just enough bad examples for people to shy away from it. And then in summer of 2019, the federal government the bank announced $20 million investment in water and wastewater project on a town north of Kitchener called Mapleton Township. And what this basically does is to invite private investors to come in and do a whole kit and caboodle of design, finance, build, upgrade, maintain, operate the township's water and wastewater projects for 20 years. So basically, the town will just give some consortium their water for 20 years. And the thing that we've noticed is that the bank is lending the winning proponent, which they're deciding on, money, this money 2% interest rate, whereas they could just basically subsidizing what they would have been able to borrow for like at least 7%, like we've discussed before, subsidizing a P3 project that otherwise would not have been viable in this township. And the reality is that this is a common pattern that's seen across a lot of other projects that the bank is funding. They're calling it an innovative funding model, basically a way to work around how you criticize P3 projects for having higher interest rate. They're like, oh, don't worry, we will subsidize the private investors' interest rate. and use that to prey on municipalities that don't basically have the capacity to fund these significant infrastructure projects in the first place. And if we think about this reality of COVID-19, municipalities are more cash strapped than before. They are running out of money, and they are essentially looking for ways to save money every way they can. And then we have a federal agency with the capacity and the funding potential to help municipality get out of that situation, stimulate the economy with a significant investment in infrastructure, put people back to work. But instead, we're looking at an agency that will promote P3s and promote a system of corporate capture that is not using a model that has been very clearly demonstrated to not benefit taxpayers. And so that's very concerning in many ways. And I know that Minister McKenna is looking for shovel-ready projects and see the role of the infrastructure bank playing a critical role. And so I think we have the opportunity right now to both push back at any distant thought or proposal of a P3 in your community, but also to push our federal politicians to do better. They have the opportunity, they have the capacity to do so much better, to use that money in a much more sensible way, to actually invest in what a just and green and sustainable recovery could be, instead of continuing to promote such a flawed model.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was muted there. Anyway, V, thank you very much for that summary. It's actually like you read my mind, because really we want to talk about now, what do we do going forward? Because so obviously the P3 model tends to fleece ordinary people, but also doesn't actually do the things that it's supposed to do, which is deliver infrastructure projects on time, on budget, and in any sort of minute working order whatsoever. So Stuart, you're up. In Ottawa, you've had direct experience with a massively failed P3. What do you and your organization do to push back against this trend?
I think, one of the really interesting things about this whole LRT debacle has been how engaged regular people have been with it. I think with P3s sometimes, when you talk about, I guess, more traditional P3s in like building hospitals, building buildings and so forth, it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind for people. They don't sort of see it on an everyday basis. And Ottawa has I would say, a reputation for sort of get it going along with things and not raising a fuss, don't rock the boat. And I've been surprised about how many people have sort of have been shocked at what's been going on with the LRT, and how many people are sort of raising their voice and asking difficult questions to OC Transpo, asking difficult questions to their counselors themselves. And I think that because these failures are, you can see these on a day-to-day basis. If you're commuting downtown, if there's a delay, you feel it yourself. You don't do that if a building sort of goes over budget, if a hospital building goes over budget and so forth. But when transit doesn't work, you notice it immediately, and it affects your daily life. So I think this has really galvanized people in a way that I haven't seen Ottawa residents been galvanized around an issue in a long time. And people are really starting to question what's the value of these agreements. Are we going to be locked into these for the next 30 years? Is this sort of the way things are going? And our organization started off as a ridership group to ask for better service, mostly along buses, surprisingly, better bus service and so on. And then the LRT came along, and that really sort of captured our organization. And we've been really focusing on that itself. So, when these issues happen, and I'm thinking back to, when the subway breaks down in Toronto, like it did a month or two ago, and people get really, they see firsthand what happens if there's poor maintenance, if the infrastructure hasn't been kept up, and so on. And I think that that's a real opportunity to sort of galvanize people around an issue. And what we've been doing was we've been encouraging people to raise these issues with OC Transpo, raise these issues with their elected representatives, and to actually get involved with the process itself, whether that is by contacting people, whether that's doing delegations at transit commission meetings or at city council meetings. But to actually get involved in the process itself and to raise these issues at constantly, and not sort of let things slide, which has been the Ottawa way. The other thing which I'll be curious to see what happens is Ottawa has a tendency of having some very, very high voter turnout for provincial and federal elections. And it's a very politically engaged city, very politically engaged community. But municipal elections have not had the same sort of turnout. And people sort of, although it's the thing that sort of affects their daily life the most, and they deal with it on a day-to-day basis, which they might not with the province or with the federal government, people sort of tended to not really get involved with municipal politics, or to not really pay attention and not really ask serious questions. And I think one of the things that this LRT issue has really taught us is that you need to step up, you need to get involved with municipal politics, you need to make sure that you are supporting councillors and candidates who are going to fight for public transit, who are going to ask these difficult questions. Because when they don't, when they sort of just go along with everything, you get what happens with our stage 2 of the LRT. And just to do a brief recap, is that this was the second stage where the winning bid was NSC-Lavalin. They didn't meet the technical score for this bid, and this is the north-south the north-south extension that goes through sort of the middle of Ottawa itself. So NSC-Lavalin didn't meet the bid, the standard bid. Some city councillors were asking, okay, well, what did they score? Why didn't they score well? So on and so forth. And there's hemming and hawing, and the argument was, we can't release this information because it's proprietary, and so on and so forth. But overall, council passed stage 2, even knowing that this bid didn't meet the technical specifications in pretty egregious ways. I mean, if you're doing a technical bid for a diesel rail line, don't put in that you've designed it for an electrical rail line. This is fairly basic stuff. And so I think people have sort of seen, okay, we need to elect people who are going to question these things, who are going to ask these difficult questions, and who are going to be willing to say, you know what, is this the best deal for the citizens of Ottawa? Is this the best deal for taxpayers? And if it's not, is to say no, and sort of, instead of sort of saying, we need this, and if we don't vote for this now, then we're never going to get it, but actually asking serious questions, because at the end of the day, the city is paying for it, and taxpayers are paying for it. So a re-engagement with municipal politics, because people have sort of seen how important it is to their daily lives. That is one thing that we're going to try to promote, that I think that all transit advocates should try to promote in cities across Canada, is get engaged at the municipal level, because that is where oftentimes the decisions are made.
Okay, excellent. And obviously, TTCriders is a big proponent of that, so it's good to. I'll echo that. But the Council of Canadians has been, to my mind, the leading voice against the privatization of public assets in our country as a whole. So, what do you suggest that we do to stop the P3 trend?
Yeah, it is very difficult, and like in my line of work, unless it's in your face, it's hard for someone for like an average person to pay attention to how do you make procurement attractive? And but the devil is in the details, right? And sometimes it's the engagement with those like nitty-gritty details that ultimately translate to whether your city, you can get to work and home every day, whether you have reliable access to clean water, or in the middle of a pandemic, whether your healthcare system can support all the people that are sick and ill. And I think if this pandemic has shown us anything, it's that the decades-long attack on public services like public transit, like water, like healthcare, is going to come back and bite us if we don't pay attention now. And I think we must stay vigilant. For the council, we have I have the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of local chapters who are very engaged in local communities, and like Stuart and like both of your organization are doing incredible work in terms of like drawing attention to these very serious issues. I think, yeah, the number one thing is to be there and be aware of any proposed privatization. And I think Robert, if he was able to come on the panel, would agree that your union locals are your best friends. They would be the folks who are the first to hear about and the first to be on the front line against any fight against privatization. So start building a coalition with these folks, because that's where once you are able to build a coalition that's beyond just like the usual suspects, it brings a much more powerful voice to city council, to province, and likewise to the federal government. And it's possible to take back control of what should be in the public interest. So a trend in water that we've seen in the last decade is called remunicipalization, where in the last 15 years, we have seen 295 municipalities taking back control of their water from privatization across the world. So it's possible, and people are doing it because people are realizing that no, private investors and private companies do not have my best interest at heart, and this is something like transit, like healthcare. These are things that should be in the public trust and should be held in public hands and should be accountable to public scrutiny. And so we can continue to do that. And like Stuart said, in getting engaged in all levels. So the local levels is where you see the immediate impact. But like we discussed with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, higher levels of government can either play a significant role in supporting municipalities, or they can be the folks that peddle privatization, and we need to pressure them in the opposite direction. So there's a lot of organizing that can happen. I would encourage folks to organize with your local community chapters, make friends with your local unions, and get politically active.
Yeah, I think in Canada, we're reasonably fortunate that we still have a labor movement that is strong or reasonably strong. And so we have a base to build from. We're sadly in a crisis right now, but Naomi Klein writes a lot about how the quote unquote bad guys will use the crisis to their own ends, but we can do this too. It's time to imagine a better world. So you both are talking about being involved, and we have a pretty vibrant discussion going on the YouTube live. I can give you a few comments that people have said. Someone says there's no example anywhere of public transit privatization anywhere in the world that has delivered on its promises. A good example just north of Steeles, York Region Transit. This person didn't elaborate, but in short, the service sucks up there since they privatized, so it's not good. I also have a comment for clarification, and this is my bad here. The TTC only has a verbal commitment that it will operate the crosstown for 10 years, and maintenance has still been contracted out to SNC-Lavalin, who flipped the contract to Bombardier for 30 years. So even with that crosstown line where supposedly the TTC will be operating it, it looks like maybe not, with all the problems that come along with that. So I do have a question for you guys, and we'll see if we can answer this to the best of our abilities. But what is being planned for the reduced use of transit services during COVID-19 going forward, and what are the estimates for reduced passenger traffic going forward? I could say something, but I'll leave it up to whoever wants to answer that. Maybe Stuart.
I'll take a crack at it. You know, this is and so many economists and pundits have sort of said this. You know, we're really working off of an unknown playbook with this, and nobody really knows what the situation is going to look like 2 months, 6 months, a year from now. So, you know, the biggest concern that sort of we have as an organization is that you know, the economic downturn that's going to result from COVID-19 is going to be a excuse to either pare back or cut services on transit itself. And we've seen that that's happened in recessions before, and it's been part of sort of the playbook when there's an economic downturn. I think that there is a bit of an opportunity here in terms of trying to grow ridership. Is that you know, looking forward, we want to get, you know, we want to get sort of the different levels of government more involved in funding transit itself. You know, cities themselves have very few revenue streams. It's either from municipal taxes or it's from fares in terms of actually raising revenue for transit. And this could be a really good opportunity to redefine sort of how the province and the federal government reinvests in public transit service, not just in the infrastructure, but actually in the day-to-day running of things. And how do we make it safer? How do we make it cleaner? How do we make it more accessible? I think these are all questions that we need to start thinking about. I think it's too early to sort of say, you know, what's the ridership going to look like in September? You know, there's all these questions about are we going to go back to the regular way of working? Is telecommuting going to become the new normal, and so on? You know, the honest question is we don't know. We don't know what this is, but I think that there's a real impetus right now in terms of transforming how we deal with transit, not just public transit, but, you know, our big argument here in Ottawa over the past couple of weeks is how do we open up to all other forms of transit, to walking, to cycling? How do we make a better city for people who want to use these alternate means? Is it by closing off roads? Is it by making more bike lanes and so on and so forth? Giving people that sort of physical distance that they need in this pandemic. So, you know, there's not sort of one single answer in terms of restoring transit ridership. This is going to be on a week-to-week, month-by-month basis. But the important thing is to fight for continued transit funding and transit service, and sort of not let that service be pared back because of the economic situation. Because when a lot of that stuff goes, it's very hard to get that put back in. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, great. I actually do have another question here, and just apologies, I'm getting them emailed to me as we talk, because there's a bit of a lag on the YouTube. So this another question here is, Stuart touched on how Ottawa is addressing P3 related issues with the Confederation line. What else would he and other activists suggest to address these issues moving forward in Ottawa? Before you answer, I can also actually expand that to V as well, because you did also mention remunicipalization of municipal water. It seems to be a similar question. How do we get out of P3s once we're in them? V, do you want to take a crack at that? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I think the fight to take back control after your project has gone into a P3s truly require political leadership, and we have seen like some level of that being demonstrated through the notice of default with RTG and in other municipalities, but it ultimately required some continuous pressure from residents to their councillors to say this is unacceptable. We need something better, and to push back against the push back and demand a better and take back control. It is going to be a lot more expensive to get out of an existing P3 than it is to to avoid one. So it is going to be challenging, and I think it requires like some serious organizing, and we have seen that a lot of that being done through like broad-based coalitions of not just labor but environmental activists and transit advocates and folks from all walks of life to push back on these issues. So yeah, I think getting organized is the very first step, and finding serious allies on city council that would support you in that attempt.
Yeah, I think in terms of that, it's a really good question. It's incredibly hard, and I completely agree. You need sort of the political will to do it. I think that there's the lessons that we sort of learned from the stage one of LRT here, I think will help us going forward in the future is asking for more accountability, more transparency with things. But that has to be continuously pushed, not only by taxpayers, by riders, and by councillors. But that's going to take a concerted effort over the course of the next 5 or 10 years. And it's really hard to sort of keep that momentum going. You know, if the system sort of ends up balancing itself and it starts sort of working well, and people sort of say, well, things are going okay right now. You know, we can't rely sort of on the system breaking down all the time. But I think it's going to take. It's an incredibly complex and it's an expensive question. And to be honest, I don't know how to answer that sort of in the new fiscal environment that municipalities are in, especially after COVID-19, because they just do not have the financial resources to do any of this. You know, my biggest concern, you know, especially from a City of Ottawa viewpoint, is what happens if, you know, these consortiums eventually say, well, this isn't worth our while anymore. We're in it to make a profit, and we're not making that profit. You know, RTGs only, you know, in terms of the payments that they've received, I think they're probably only going to get their first payment in April, and so they haven't actually been paid since the system was operated. So, you know, if that sort of continues, and if there's further breakdowns once ridership goes back up, and once the system starts to once, you know, things hopefully get back to normal. If there are continuous problems and RTG still isn't getting paid, and they're still spending that money on maintenance, on repairs, you know, how long do they sort of stick it out? And that's a question that nobody's really asked before, because, you know, unlike a P3, where, you know, where if you're building a building, you know, once the building's done, you know, it's a different, you know, some P3s have operating contracts with buildings itself, but operating a building's different than operating a transit system. And if they sort of realize, you know, we're locked into this thing for 30 years, but we're not going to really make any money off it, they might have a business case to withdraw from that contract. And then what happens then? And that's a question that nobody's really been able to answer at any level, municipally or provincially or federally, is what happens if these transit P3s don't work out. Who then takes over? And, you know, is it the city that takes over? We don't know, because nobody sort of has gamed this out.
Yeah, I would quickly add that from an example with water P3s, we've seen some municipalities seeing company changing hands several times in the span of a decade, because they just could not make it work and could not handle the public pressure. And so it's a matter of standing behind your government, your councillors when they're making difficult decisions to take take back control. But it's also a good lesson in a good precaution that when you enter into a P3, it might not be the same consortium down the road, 20 years down the road. They, like Hamilton, see Enron taking over their water at one point. So we should really be more concerned with P3s than when right from the get-go.
Yeah, Enron, that's a name we haven't heard for a while. So it's really interesting, because right now we're in a crisis situation. I remember, we all remember 2008 and that recession, and, you know, a lot of money was shoveled out the door, but the P3 model was a key part of that. You mentioned that was the Harper area, and so a lot of those projects were P3s. So the same thing could happen now with the infrastructure bank being a key plank in the federal government's recovery plan. But as we've heard from you too, and from our experience as transit organizers in Toronto, there's also an opportunity for progressives to reshape the agenda. So I really do just want to thank both of our panelists for giving up their Sunday afternoon, or part of it, to talk about this really important issue, as well as thank everyone who attended this afternoon, because you're part of the solution by doing this and by commenting and engaging with this topic. As you leave, there actually are some tasks to take away, and you thought you'd get away without homework, but that is wrong. You have homework. So with a massive drop in ridership due to COVID-19, transit systems are going to be facing potentially some huge cuts in the coming weeks and months. You know, we're in this state because the systems themselves rely so much on the fare box to fund day-to-day operations, because the upper levels of government have essentially stepped away from funding transit operations. Ontario stopped doing it in the 90s. The feds have never done so. So right now, we really need those governments to give emergency funding to transit right now so that it keeps running, but also keep doing so permanently, so this never happens again. And we also don't have a big shift away from sustainable transportation as we recover from COVID. So TTCriders is campaigning on this issue right now. We have a campaign going called Keep Transit Moving. You can visit the website we've created, which is fittingly called keeptransitmoving.ca, to take action. We have a petition to sign. You can submit also a video message that's going to be going to your MPPs and MPs. And you can share said video message using the hashtag #KeepTransitMoving. It's pretty easy to remember. As homework goes, that's pretty simple. But we've hit 2:01 p.m. So I do want to just say thank you for everyone who attended. Time to stay safe and wash your hands. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.